Welcome, everyone. It's really 5 minutes till start time, but we have a little prelude of music related to immigration. This is my handsome husband, Phil Hart, and he is a singer-songwriter, retired.
Good afternoon. I'm going to do a couple songs for you. The first one, I had to pick another one, but Joseph Jomas here is wanting to refer to this other one. And it has to do with identity and with the idea of immigration that we have of birthright. And we have this right to be here and other people don't. And it's ironic because we left the birthright thing in England because we didn't believe in that. But I don't remember choosing my parents like you did. Therefore, thy skin color, the language that I was taught, etc. And this song explores that question. God knows I love my mother. God knows I didn't choose her. God knows it's just my good luck that my daddy's not a loser. I did not pick this white skin, though it fits me pretty well. It's my discount racial tattoo, yeah, it keeps me out of jail. Well, I could have been born brown, could have been born poor, could have been born crippled. Why I wasn't, I'm not sure, but God knows, God knows. And God knows that I'm a Christian, and God knows it's not my fault. My ma sent me to Sunday school and I learned what I was taught. God knows that there's a heaven. God knows that there's a hell. God knows that after we found out, well, we're not allowed to tell. Well, could have been born Hindu. Could have been a Jew. I could have been born Muslim. Hell, I could have been born you. God knows. God knows. And God knows I love my country and speak English pretty well. God hung me on my family tree, yeah, this is where I fell. God knows that I'm a gringo, and I suspect it's true. I did not earn this birthright, no, and neither friend did you. Well, I could have been born Chinese, could have been born Greek, I could have been born Haitian, or been born Mozambique. God knows, God knows, God knows. I bet she knows, God knows. This next song is going to serve as our opening prayer and the portal into this conversation. And this song was inspired when I took a trip to Texas a few years back. And I was sitting in the living room of a man named Lupe Aguilar. And he was explaining to me, Brownsville's right on the border of Texas and Mexico. And he said, you know, my family moved to this part of the world. And he said the irony is that my grandsons, 300 years later, are being pulled over and asked for identity papers. And I wondered if we maybe should just go ahead and change that poem at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. Because we don't apparently want the tired and the poor and the huddled masses anymore. There she stands above the water, and she holds her torch up high to welcome all the sons and daughters who come here to find their life. And she promises to welcome all the tired and the poor. I guess someone should tell her they're not welcome anymore. Yeah, she calls the hungry masses who are yearning to breathe free. She's the mother of the immigrant, Our Lady of Liberty. I met a family down in Brownsville, been there since 17 and 10. Said they never crossed the border. Said the border, it crossed them when the United States of arrogance invaded with a war, taking what belonged to Mexico. Now they're not welcome anymore. And she calls the hungry masses who are yearning to breathe free. She's the mother of the immigrant, Our Lady of Liberty. Well, my daddy's daddy's great-granddad, he sailed across the sea to the home of the brave and the land of the free. But if he made that journey now, and he was standing on our shore, I bet he'd find, like others, he's not welcome anymore. Here she calls the huddled masses who are yearning to breathe free. She's the mother of the immigrant, Our Lady of Liberty. She's the mother of the immigrant, Our Lady of Liberty.
Thank you, Bill. He has another one called Jesus Was a Migrant, and maybe at the end, if there's time, he can sing that for us as well. Now, this afternoon, we have Dr. Hart and her friends here to deal with us with immigration. It's one of the big arms of justice or injustice that we need to contend with. And Dr. Julie Hart has organized this program for this afternoon. And if I were to read to you her curriculum vitae, we would be here till 8 o'clock. So all we're going to do is give a little biographical summary of Julie's, is that going to be on now? Oh, okay. All right. Dr. Julie Hart is an associate professor of sociology and peace and justice at Ohio Dominican University. She received her master's degree in international peace studies in 1992 and her Ph.D. in sociology in 1995 from the University of Notre Dame. She specializes in areas of causes of collective violence, nonviolent social change, ethnic relations, and conflict resolution. Her sociology research has focused on dynamics of social change in political and educational organizations. Currently, her research examines the dynamics of significant identity change among anti-war veterans. She recently had a book published entitled Pathways to Pacifism and Anti-War Activism Among U.S. Veterans: The Role of Moral Identity in Personal Transformation. In addition, she is researching now what teaching methods are most effective for improving the cultural competency of education. Dr. Hart has volunteered with the Christian Peacemaker team each summer since 1997, doing human rights work in Israel, in Palestine, and until 2015 in Colombia. She lived and worked in Guatemala for 2 years doing peace and justice education with the Mennonite Church, and she continues to teach a course in Guatemala on poverty and development with ODU students every year whom she takes on this tour. She enjoys gardening, reading, walking, and community activism, plus all of that. And she is married and has 2 grown sons, and the best is yet to be. She will soon be a grandmother. So this is Dr. Julia.
Phil and I are actually waiting for a phone call any day now. My daughter-in-law is due on October 1st. Welcome to our panel discussion on justice for immigrants. I've entitled it, I Was a Stranger, and You Welcomed Me, to reflect the faith-based perspective. We hope the panelists and our Skyped-in panelist will be able to provide multiple perspectives on justice for immigrants today, with an emphasis on a faith-based perspective. First, we'll hear, after my intro, from Pastor Joel Miller, pastor of Columbus Mennonite Church. Next, we'll hear from Joe Moss, who is an attorney in Columbus, criminal attorney, and he specializes in immigrant situations. And he was originally from Cuba, is a refugee himself. And finally, Dr. Austin Kocher, an academic geographer with expertise in immigration policy, originally from Sunbury, Ohio, all the way from Sunbury. And we had hoped to have Edith Espinal via Skype.
I just got word that she's probably going to join.
Okay.
And she's right there.
Edith is on your left, and her translator is Carrie Variety, and she is on the right. Edith Espinal is a Columbus resident, originally from Mexico, who has been living in sanctuary at Columbus Mennonite Church for almost a year. So she'll be telling us her story. So our plan is, I'm going to talk for 10 minutes with an introduction, and then each of our panelists 10 minutes. Edith, through translation, 10 minutes, and then we'll open it for your questions. So looking forward to your questions. So I want to start by building on Ron Karsten's discussion of justice from 2 weeks ago. He was speaking, if you were here, about global poverty. And I will define justice, much as he did, as the right relationship we have first with ourselves, then with others, and with God. And the firm resolve to give each person what he or she is due. A just society requires equality not only before the law, as well as protection of basic civil and criminal rights. Some of these, the right to life, to free speech, to association and religion, the right to education, to vote, to marry who we please, to work where we please, to freedom of movement, to protection of privacy, to freedom of opinion, to peaceful assembly, and justice requires that each person be protected from discrimination, regardless of age, sex, race, ability, sexual orientation, and religious belief, and probably for our talk today, regardless of citizenship status. These basic rights are to be recognized as essential parts of the common good, which is one of the core values of Ohio Dominican and a pillar of the Dominican Sisters. Starting with this understanding as our foundation, I want to briefly review 7 components of U.S. immigration policy today and include where the Trump administration stands on each, so that our panelists might respond to these in light of their own understanding of justice for immigrants. And I will close with a brief summary of the Catholic Church's position on justice for immigrants from 2016. So the information that I'm going to use on U.S. immigration policy is from the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan and well-respected source of information. In other words, we're not talking fake news here, folks. This is real. Most people would agree on it. Nearly 34 million lawful immigrants live in the United States today. This is about 10% of our population. Most live and work here after receiving lawful permanent residence, also known as a green card, while others receive temporary visas available to students and to workers. For years, U.S. policy proposals have sought to shift the nation's immigration system away from its current emphasis on family reunification, that should be a common term, you know, and employment-based migration, and towards a point system that prioritizes the admission of immigrants with certain educational and employment qualifications, especially high-tech fields and engineering. These proposals have received renewed attention under the Trump administration. So I'm going to go through 7 different forms of, or pathways to enter the United States. And first I'll talk about family-based immigration, also called reunification, or by the Trump administration it would be called chain migration. So in 2016, nearly 1 million people received family-based U.S. lawful permanent residence. This program allows someone to receive a green card if they already have a spouse, child, sibling, or parent living in the U.S. with U.S. citizenship, or in some special cases, a green card. Immigrants from countries with large numbers of applicants often wait 20 years for this legal way to enter the country, because a single country, by law, can only account for 7% of all green cards issued annually. So too many are on tap from Mexico, for example, or from Guatemala. President Donald Trump has proposed restricting family reunification or chain migration based on green cards to only spouses and minor children in the future. The second pathway to citizenship in the United States is for refugee admissions. We have many students at Ohio Dominican, especially Somalis, who have come via this route. The U.S. admitted nearly 85,000 refugees in 2016. For 2018, refugee admissions have been capped at nearly half that, a little more than half that, 45,000. The lowest since Congress created the modern refugee program in 1980 for those fleeing persecution in their home country. One of Trump's first acts as president in 2017 was to freeze refugee admissions, citing security concerns. Admissions from all countries restarted in 2018, though applications from 11 countries deemed high risk by the administration are admitted on a case-by-case basis. The third way to enter the United States legally is we have employment-based green cards. And in 2016, nearly 140,000 employment-based green cards were awarded to foreign workers, mostly unskilled, and their families. A Senate bill would replace the existing eligibility criteria with a point system that would give priority to higher tech workers and engineers. Fourth, we have diversity visas. You may have heard of these. Each year, about 50,000 people receive green cards through the U.S. Diversity Visa Program, also known as the Visa Lottery. And we also have many students at Ohio Dominican who have come via the Visa Lottery. Since the program began in 1995, more than 1 million immigrants have received green cards through this lottery, primarily from Asian and African nations. Trump has said he wants to eliminate the program, which seeks to diversify the U.S. immigrant population by granting visas to underrepresented nations. The fifth route to U.S. citizenship is H-1B visas. You may have heard of these, but in 2016, 180,000 high-skilled foreign workers received H-1B visas. Under the Trump administration, the number of H-1B apps was challenged by the federal government, and H-1B applications challenged by the federal government has increased. In addition, the administration has considered restricting the number of years that a foreign worker can hold an H-1B visa. So these are not permanent visas, these are temporary as needed. The sixth route to the United States and eventual citizenship is Daca. I'm sure many of you have heard of Daca. About 700,000 unauthorized immigrants have temporary work permits and protection from deportation from the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and this happened in 2017. The program has been central to negotiations as Congress currently debates changes in the U.S. immigration law. Trump ended the program in 2017. However, 2 federal court cases have temporarily kept Daca in place until it's resolved in the courts. And then seventh and finally are temporary protected status visas. More than 300,000 immigrants from 10 nations have permission to live and work in the United States under this program. We don't hear as much about this. They are granted visas because of war or hurricanes or other disasters in their home countries make it dangerous for them to return. Many are expected to lose their benefits in 2018 or 19, some of them having been here almost 20 years. The Trump administration has said it will not renew the program for people from El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Sudan, who together account for 76% of enrolled immigrants in this program. President Trump's emphasis in proposed changes is on what he believes leads to justice for Americans first, especially that which benefits U.S. business and industry and the U.S. worker. So we want to keep that in mind, that President Trump also has a very strong perception of what justice is. He's just focusing on America first and what he believes is best for us here. But I want to end my time in the introduction with a brief summary of the Catholic Church position on immigration from 2016 from a Pontifical Council on the Pastoral Care of Migrants, and it is entitled, "I Was a Stranger and You Made Me Welcome." And this summarizes the Catholic councils, but not the popes and not the entire Catholic Church's major position on migration in the modern world, but it also summarizes my own. The council reminds the Church that it consists of a pilgrim people from all parts of the globe. The document draws on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to recognize the right of every person to leave any country, including his or her own, and the right to return to their home country. Although the Church supports this right and even the necessity to migrate, it does not encourage migration due to the difficulties involved. But when leaving one's country is necessary, destination nations, it says, are to treat migrants not just as workers, but as children of God, with all the human and civil rights that native citizens enjoy. The document acknowledges the crushing poverty in many nations that drives citizens to migrate, the importance of multinational corporations in investing in poor nations in order to provide jobs at a livable wage so families can stay in their home countries and support their families. It also acknowledges the necessity of development assistance from wealthy nations such as our own to address the root causes of poverty. When development is inadequate, it says, war or natural disasters are present, or corruption and human rights abuses are severe, the Council encourages nations to welcome migrants. It states that blocking migrants only encourages illegal immigration and all the challenges this brings. to the immigrant as well as the destination nation. Overall, the Pontifical Council sees migration, and this is important in my views of things too, as a path to improving all nations, as a path to improving all people, calling the mixing of peoples integral to the quote-unquote new heaven and new earth as envisioned in the final biblical book of Revelation. So I'll invite our speakers now to just go down the line, and each will speak for about 10 minutes. Write down your questions so we can get back to those at the end after we hear from Edith and Carrie. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. I'm Joel Miller. I'm a pastor at Columbus Mennonite Church. And next Tuesday marks the year anniversary that Edith Espinal moved into our church building to seek sanctuary from being deported and separated from her family. So just to start on a personal note, I just want to say how difficult this work is sometimes. People's lives, families. I was talking with Edith before coming here. It's a difficult day with the anniversary coming up, making difficult decisions about where to press, where to push, how to get out of sanctuary and back home into the family apartment. It's just really difficult. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm carrying that today, and Edith is carrying that today. But thank you for being here to listen to her story and to what we have to say. I've been asked to speak about 10 minutes to talk about the biblical and moral foundations of seeking immigrant justice. And there's any number of angles one could take for this, but I want to follow a single thread. And I had the crazy idea of actually bringing a Bible with me, and I'm actually going to read from it. Just to set it up a little bit, I want to focus on a thread through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the foundational for Jewish faith and for Jesus as a Jew who drew his teachings and ethics from Torah. I want to pick this up in the book of Exodus. So just to set it up a little bit, you may remember Jacob, Abraham and Sarah's grandson, has a big family. Like all families, they have family conflict. They sell one of their brothers into slavery in Egypt. He stays in Egypt, rises to power. The other sons and family live in a place in Canaan where there's eventually a famine. They come down to Egypt, get to be provided for by Joseph, who's in charge now of all the granaries, and has an in with the Pharaoh. But this Pharaoh eventually dies. Another Pharaoh comes up who does not know Joseph, and the Israelites, as they come to be called, are enslaved in Egypt. And they're enslaved for about 400 years. And then when Moses and Miriam come onto the scene, this is when Yahweh, the Lord, is delivering them out of slavery. This is sort of the founding story of the people of Israel. So that's where I want to pick it up. And I'm just going to read through a number of very brief passages and see if you can hear a theme. This is Exodus 13:3. Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord your God brought you out from there by strength of hand." This is Exodus 22:21. Now when the law is being given, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." Exodus 23:9. "You shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien." And alien, this word alien, ger in Hebrew, could be sojourner, could be immigrant, could be stranger. The New Revised Standard Version here translates it alien. You know the heart of a sojourner, an immigrant, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Leviticus 19:33-34. This is the same chapter where it says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And now listen what it says at the end. "When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien, the immigrant. The one who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the immigrant as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 5:15. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Is anyone detecting a theme here? Deuteronomy, we're still in the Torah here, 10:19. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And finally, Deuteronomy 15:15. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. So the thread is one of memory and a particular way of remembering that this community is to engage in. A particular form of remembering, a continual call to remember a past event that informs present life, present practice, present ways, really that becomes a foundation of ethical and moral action. This form of collective memory and this constant reminder to remember who you are and to claim this story as one's own, even if it didn't happen to you in your lifetime, to remember that you were oppressed, that you were a slave, that you were an alien, that you were a foreigner, that you were a sojourner, that you were an immigrant. And now you have been liberated, no longer restricted to this condition, and now you're in such a position in memory to empathize, to be in solidarity with those who remain in that position. And this affects ethics. Memory is a foundation for ethics. And this is so important that it gets ritualized in Israelite practice and Jewish practice today, the Passover, the Seder, lest you forget who you are, and lest you forget the basis of how we act toward others. So it's interesting that this doesn't try to convince us that the other is, it's at least not initially, that the other is a worthy person. But it has to do with, they are a worthy person, but it points first to self and the kind of story that we tell ourselves, because stories and myths are incredibly powerful. We have our own set of national myths about pilgrims seeking religious freedom, about pioneers settling the wilderness, about a particular kind of dream, an American dream that involves this and this and this, and of course we all want this and have a right to this. These are stories we tell ourselves that actually inform action and how we treat others. So in the Torah, this certain way of remembering is the foundation of ethics. And it's so important, I'm going to read one more passage. Exodus 20 starts this way. Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, if you recognize that, you shall have no other gods before me, that is what we consider the first of the 10 Commandments. The way the 10 Commandments get introduced is a reminder that you were in slavery, oppressed, and that becomes the basis of living a life of freedom. Because of this and because you've been brought out, you are now free to live in such a way that doesn't enslave others. And we can read the whole 10 Commandments through that lens. Just a couple ways this gets carried forward in Scripture in a couple ways, and they're not either or. But one's the prophetic tradition, which calls, which builds on this memory and calls on the people and the state to be its best self, basically. Prophets shape public memory. They challenge myth. They challenge stories that have us act in ways, in unjust ways, and they call on the state and the collective, the people, to walk toward that far horizon of justice. It's a big work, the prophetic tradition. The other tradition, which we see in some of the New Testament church, the early church, is what I would call the church and empire. And this is the monastic tradition. It's also part of the Anabaptist tradition that I'm a part of. And that is not just calling on the state to do its thing and to be just, but to actually enact that as a community of faith, to bring the kingdom of God visible on earth now. And we don't have to wait for policy. We don't have to wait for the right person in office, but to enact that. And of course, not neglect the prophetic arc of what we're working on. But both of those call on memory, and as a church, I see the Eucharist, the communion table, as this remembering of Christ, as our memory in the works. Let me I'll end with a couple things to bring it to us. I think there are two. I heard someone say once that you choose your ancestors, which I think is in some ways true, and in other ways, like Phil said, you get what you get, and only God knows why. But we do have, so one of the calls, I think, is to choose this faith tradition, or it's a human tradition that says that we were once oppressed and now we've been liberated by God, and that affects how we live in the moment. So identifying with Christian Jewish tradition certainly grounds us in that, and it grounds us in our ethics. And the other is just for us, memory-wise, to look into our own family history and to actually find this in our own family history, to find those stories that have resulted of movement, of oppression, of immigration. One thing I learned this summer, I had a sabbatical this summer, and I went up for a few days. I went up to Northeast Ohio, Wayne County, a little town called Kidron that has a historical center there. And I did a little family research. My mom's paternal side came from Switzerland in the 1830s. They were Mennonites, Anabaptists, in a reformed state church type area. And Mennonites at the time, because their marriages were not blessed by reformed pastors and because their babies weren't baptized, they were basically considered illegitimate children. The marriages were illegitimate. Mennonites could not own land, and so they had to rent, and the rents got pushed higher, and they kept getting pushed higher and higher up into the mountains, the less fertile land. They couldn't get good jobs, and so they immigrated. This was part of why they came to the U.S. It's a story of, you were once here and you're here. Now, the complicated fact, it gets really complicated really quick because they moved to the U.S. and immediately become part of the white settler movement in the United States that were still living out, still trying to undo the racism and genocide that they walked right into. But that memory is important to me personally, and I think we all have that in our family histories. My final point is that when we were deciding for sanctuary as a congregation, it just so happened that we had not met Edith, but the Sunday before, we even knew Edith was seeking sanctuary. We had our 55-year church anniversary. We missed our 50th, and so we're like 55. We're like, let's do a big one now. And we were telling stories about the church, and we told stories. One of the prominent stories that was told was about the sanctuary movement in the 80s, when our congregation was involved, not in hosting, but in supporting a Salvadoran woman in the Columbus area. And we told that story, and it was a very important story to retell. And then the next week, it just so happens that there's a new sanctuary movement at our doorstep. And having that memory fresh for us was really important in our decision making. I want to say too that we have, because of the 1 year in sanctuary, we have a week of action next week, and I want to pass these around just so you have them in hand and encourage you to show up for one of them. But that's all for me.
And it's my turn. Thank you, Joel. That was great. And I also want to thank Dr. Hart for her invitation, and Sister Vice President Travis, and President Gervaisi, who I think may be here. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. For this opportunity, I've been looking forward to meeting with you and sharing with you some of my own experiences and my own ideas concerning the issue of sanctuary and certainly immigration in general. But just very briefly, like Dr. Hart said, I am a criminal defense attorney. I have been practicing for 40 years, primarily here in Columbus, Ohio. And for the past 20 years or so, since 1999 certainly, I have been representing exclusively newly arrived immigrants, the vast majority of whom are undocumented. And my most important function, as everybody knows, including the county prosecutor and the city prosecutor and ICE, is hiding people. Now, I attend Columbus Mennonite Church together with Dr. Hart and Phil and Joel, so on, and I've done so for the past 15 years. And I was asked to assist in the initial study, and I'm actually taking up exactly where Joel left up on that fateful day when the congregation gathered to discuss the possibility of being able to host an individual seeking sanctuary. And I am experienced in federal prosecutions and have studied the history of prosecutions associated with the sanctuary movement. And yes, there have been some in the past. And maybe we can talk a little bit later during the Q&A concerning the legality, because I want to move forward to discuss the issue of justice and social justice, as Dr. Hart asked us to do. Now, it's worthy of note, and I've always wondered about this, that conservatives often celebrate the concept of law and order. You know, you almost never hear about law and justice, do you? Justice, what is justice? Justice is the legal or philosophical theory by which fairness is administered. As with most philosophically driven disciplines, the concept of justice differs from society to society within the relatively modern concept of legal immigration. And what's modern is the legal part, not the immigration part. If your ancestors arrived before 1924, they arrived just like Edith did, and like most of the immigrants in Columbus, Ohio, that crossed a border. According to the egalitarian, justice can exist only within the parameters of equality. Since immigration is fundamentally an individual search for a better condition, equality of opportunity and access to resources, well, that feels right, feels just. In fact, the absence of such equal access, because, as Phil said in his eloquent song, because you happen to have been born in one place versus another place, feels fundamentally unfair. We have no more control over where we are born than we are over when we are born. No more control than over the moon and the stars. And again, thank you, Phil, for your wonderful song illustrating that much better than I could. Now, my own position on immigration was formed as a consequence of three unrelated conditions. When I was 12 years old, I immigrated to the United States as a political refugee from Cuba. Some in my family supported the revolution. My cousin, Luis Condon, fought alongside Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestra. My father worked with the famous Che Guevara when the National Bank was reformed and its assets were being reassessed. I take time to mention this because my own progressive instincts regarding immigration have nothing to do with the historical revisionism of many other Cuban Americans who, much to their shame, in my view, embraced the anti-immigration stance of the Republican Party of the last 20 years. My family's own exodus from Cuba was the result of the instability and reprisals, sadly, that were going on in the early period of the revolution, since my stepfather worked for an American bank and he had done so for 25 years. However, I retained the historic yearning for progressive social causes, which were the true historical roots of Cuban politics and always have been. The second source of influence over my position on social justice and immigration comes from my Catholic upbringing, specifically from my Roman Catholic education. In Cuba, I was taught by the Salesian brothers in the same school that my father attended in the 1930s. Upon our arrival in the United States in 1961, and the year here is important, remember it, I was taught by the Sisters of Mercy in Pensacola, Florida. That's the deep South, by the way, in 1961. And these were the years of this nation's spasms during the civil rights struggle before, during, and after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These were the years when Catholic clergy marched alongside Dr. King, were in many cases beaten and arrested, and when the Vietnam War heated up during the same period, marched alongside the anti-war protesters as well. And excuse me if I get emotional when I talk about these things, because obviously I lived through much of this, and a special place in my heart for the folks that helped us when I was an immigrant and I needed help. The good sisters made a point to remind us that the world doesn't revolve around you, or as Sister Rosario would personally explain it to me, it's not about you, Joe. To remind me that as an immigrant from a racially suspect country, I might face an uncertain social future in American society. When book reports were assigned, they would suggest the biographies of famous people of color. It was through these assignments that I learned about the lives of the botanist George Washington Carver, the educator Booker T. Washington, and the liberator of Haiti, Toussaint Louverture. It was through the sisters' efforts and my firsthand witness of the marches, the sit-ins in the Deep South that I began to understand the concept of social justice. And I may want to mention that another element of Catholic education, and actually Joel mentioned this relative to the Mennonites as well, is that there is a social action element to salvation. It's what Catholics do. My wife is a prominent theologian who teaches at the Methodist Theological School. Her name is Dr. Linda Mercadante. She wrote a book 3 years ago that was very well received, that was very successful within the context of academic books, on the rise of the spiritual but not religious. So when this year, following a dream that I had had for many years of walking the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, the famous pilgrimage route through northern Spain, that, by the way, my dad walked at age 80, I said, Linda, why don't you pursue your research on this? Because I had heard that many people that are not religious walk the Camino, and we can interview some of them and find out what drove them. I don't want to talk about that part of the research, which was really interesting. Maybe you can invite her to share that with you. She would love it. But when we interviewed Catholics, guess what they said? When we asked them, why are you walking the Camino? And they all said the same thing, because we're Catholics, that's what we do. We go on pilgrimages. We do penance. This is what Catholics do, and I'd like to suggest to you that Catholics also work for social justice. Now, thirdly, I was greatly influenced by the personal stories of my own clients, people like Edith. When they began to arrive in Columbus in 1995, it became clear to me that their hopes and fears, their goals and liabilities were exactly the same as those of my family when we arrived in the United States. A more decent and hardworking group of people you will never find. A more law-abiding group of people you will never find, as Dr. Kocher's studies has revealed, and I hope that he will mention at least in passing. As he reminded me, Dr. Kocher, Franklin County, listen to this, folks, Franklin County, Ohio, leads the United States in deportations without cause or as a result of coming to the attention of immigration as a consequence of a minor traffic stop, period. The fundamental injustice of this drives, in my case at least, my support for social justice for the undocumented community. And let me close by saying something that I have repeated and I testified in front of City Council, which inspired them, at least in part, to take their position in favor of providing some degree of sanctuary to the community. The propaganda being advanced by the current administration alleging that immigrants are criminals, rapists, drug dealers, and a danger to this country is an outrage. Attorney General Jeff Sessions is lying to you. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen is lying to you. And the President of the United States is lying to you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Dr. Hart, and to the entire ODU community that through Dr. Hart I've had the opportunity to visit several times and have come to love enormously. Let me say thank you most of all to Edith, who is here with us today, and for her sacrifice and for the lessons that we should be learning about what it means to be fully and authentically human through her work. I am currently a teacher and a researcher at the University of Michigan and at Western Governors University. And I also help to run the Central Ohio Worker Center that works on immigrant and worker justice issues here in Ohio. My research is focused on immigration enforcement, essentially 2005 forward especially, around racial profiling, immigration courts, the expansion of detention and deportation, as well as immigrant rights advocacy and immigrant rights movements throughout the Midwest, the South, and along the border. So that gives you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from as a scholar and my work in the community. But what I'm going to do today is try to address the question that Dr. Hart raised, which is, what is justice? How does Christian theology and Christian living inform my views on justice? And what does just immigration policy look like? One way that I interpret this question is from a philosophical perspective, and a theological one is it possible to construct a radical critique of the immigration system from the standpoint of Christian theology? And in posing that question, I want to say that this is not an easy answer. This is a very difficult and challenging question. And it's one that I'm probably not, even though I bring the experience that I have to the question, I'm not a theologian and I'm probably not qualified to answer such a theological question, but I will try anyway. I want to state essentially my three answers, or a three-part answer to that question, add a little bit of detail, and then close, because I'm really looking forward to hearing Edith speak as well. So the three main points. The first point version of this answer is that, that the fundamental issue at the heart of immigration law is the principle of unchecked sovereignty. And I'll get into this in detail in a moment, but national sovereignty, unchecked sovereignty, sovereignty that is outside the bounds of the constitutional, outside the bounds of the Constitution, is the basis of immigration law. And whatever we can say about this legally, it's my contention here today that the starting point for people of faith must be an agreement, borne out repeatedly in the text of all major religions, and I thank Joel especially for laying this out in the Torah, that the system of government built by men, and it was built by men, mostly for men, that this system of government built by men that claims sovereignty is in direct conflict with the clear theology that God is sovereign and that there is no one else like God. On that basis, I want to challenge us all today that whatever we think personally about immigration and about immigration policy, that we cannot, on the basis of Christian theology, support a system of exclusion and of deportation of immigrants like Edith from the United States. You may want immigration controls or deportation. That may very well be your position, but you would have to use non-theological principles to do so. In making this argument, I want to shift the burden of responsibility and say it is not up to Edith to justify and defend her desire to stay here with her family. It is up to us to articulate some reason why she should not be allowed to. The second point, although the Trump administration has instituted some of the harshest and most vocal anti-immigrant policies and practices, I believe that many thoughtful people of faith often use this administration as a scapegoat for what is in fact a legacy of anti-immigrant practices that are built into how the country works. Therefore, part of our solution, although we must take our current context into consideration at every point, part of the solution is not for a just and fair system must not be simply a reaction to the current or any current administration, but should be fully informed of the violent and exploitive history that we bear. Lastly, I want to hold ourselves as people of faith accountable for creating justice within our own broken institutions and churches and universities, and remind ourselves not to be too self-congratulatory about how benevolent and moralistic we sometimes seem on the issue of immigration. Especially when we are going to welcome the stranger, we must also ask the heavy question of what are we welcoming them into? And when we are welcoming them into a country of mass incarceration, of child abuse, of police shootings of unarmed African American and minority people, we must also address that if we're welcoming them into this country, we also have a responsibility to make this a fair and just country as well. I want to elaborate these 3 points through a few examples. The first is a legal point. So when we look at the foundation of immigration law today, what makes immigration law possible and why immigrants are allowed to be treated in ways that do not conform to the US Constitution and normal civil rights and due process, the origin of that goes back to the 1880s. So in the middle to late 1800s, one of the main national economic projects in the United States was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Much of the labor for that railroad across the top middle of the United States relied on Chinese labor. Mexican labor built much of the southern railroads. Some of those railroads now go through towns where detention centers now sit. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, and just about a decade later, after these Chinese laborers who were recruited from East Asia left the countryside, the rural areas where they were building the trains, moved into cities along the West Coast. And 10 years later, because of cultural conflict, racism, and sexism, to name just a few, the first Immigration Act in the United States was passed in 1882. Prior to 1882, there were essentially no forms of exclusion in the United States. Just a few years later, an additional act in 1988 created even more exclusion from Chinese. With the original act, Chinese migrants were allowed to leave and come back to the United States, even though they were not citizens. In 1888, a law was passed called the Scott Act, and with the passage of that act, it revoked any visas that those Chinese laborers had while they were abroad, leaving 20,000 Chinese immigrants who had legal presence in the United States, who were traveling abroad, immediately revoked those visas and prevented them from re-entering the United States. This is much like the travel ban that Trump instituted in 2017 after the election, and so we see yet another example that what we see today is not new at all. The result of that was a case that went to the Supreme Court called Che Chang-ping, which was argued in 1889, which argued for Ping that it was unlawful to revoke, basically in travel, someone's visa. That was an unlawful revocation of a visa and contradicted other treaties between the United States and China. This case, which became known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, was decided as follows. The Supreme Court claimed in their decision that the power of exclusion of foreigners being an incident of sovereignty belonging to the government of the United States, the right to its exercise at any time when, in the judgment of the government, the interests of the country require it, cannot be granted away or restrained on behalf of anyone. This doctrine, which became known as the Plenary Doctrine, means that law passed by Congress in the area of immigration is not subject to judicial or constitutional review. Aside from some caveats to this that have been challenged over the years, this was a major milestone in creating and centralizing immigration enforcement within the federal government and creating eventually what we have today as the modern deportation system. That decision, the power to exclude and deport, rests solely on the sovereignty of the nation state, remains completely active today and unchallenged within immigration. For Christians, in the era of the growth of modern states from the 1500s and 1600s forward, presented a huge issue for Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, who were keenly aware that the monarch powers in the Middle Ages and the ruling elites in the Renaissance represented a threat to the power of the church and over everyday life. There's a reason that many people in the Anabaptist tradition, for instance, refused to vote and participate in government and military service. It contradicted Matthew 6:24, which says very clearly, a person cannot serve two masters. The real crisis, therefore, for Christians is not only how do we respond to the foreigner, but as Joel indicated, what is our relationship to ourselves and to those around us and to the government. It is for citizens. It requires us to ask hard questions about why we are so special to have citizenship and what the basis of this is. Not long after these Chinese exclusion cases, this issue of national citizenship continued to introduce these problems of knowledge over who would belong if, as the law said, only white people had access to citizenship. In 1923, a member of the Hindu caste in northern India was excluded from citizenship, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Even though this individual was literally Caucasian, from Caucasus region, and Aryan, this person was excluded by the Supreme Court for not being white. So even these categories of citizenship are not decided by people, but have been decided by the government for long periods of time. What I want to emphasize here is that this basis of immigration law and the basis of citizenship and sovereignty should be something that as Christians, that we should re-engage with this question of whose master we serve. I think that we should re-engage with these questions of theology that call into question whether immigration is, even as the very good statement from the Catholic Church says, you can even hear in that language that we're trying to find ways to make generosity to immigrants compatible with making our nation great or making it safe, or these other questions that inevitably come back to questions of how do we express kindness to strangers but still make sure that our country is okay and that we have borders and that we have laws that can exclude other people. And what I would challenge us here today is to say that even if we embrace we should embrace this prophetic tradition which says maybe we welcome the stranger regardless of whether or not it's okay, whether or not This is something that's sanctioned by the government. And even though there are many policy solutions that we need to consider along the way, too often our starting point is what does the law say, and not who do we serve? Who is sovereign? So even though this is my answer to the question to embrace Christian views of sovereignty over a secular nation-state views of sovereignty, I don't suggest that we have arrived at a solution. At best, it may reframe the problem and introduce new ones. But this is where I would start, with an answer that says true justice within the realm of immigration must take into account the fundamental contradiction between two forms of sovereignty, that of koinonia within Christian theology based on community of the Holy Spirit, and national sovereignty based on citizenship, which revolves around the nation state. Although American Christians have worked hard to make the two overlap, I think if you look closely, they are and remain in deep conflict, and it may be upon us to reopen those contradictions and find a new way forward. Thank you.
No. Hola a todos, buenas tardes.
So, hi everyone, good afternoon.
Espero que nos puedan escuchar bien.
I hope you can hear us well.
Okay. Mi nombre es Edith Espinal.
My name is Edith Espinal.
Estoy viviendo en un santuario ahorita aquí en Columbus, Ohio.
I'm living in the Mennonite church here in Clinton, Ohio.
Ya voy a cumplir un año de estar aquí en santuario.
I'm about to reach 1 year of being here in Sanctuary.
Decidí tomar santuario porque tengo una conversación.
I decided to enter Sanctuary because I have a deportation order.
Yo tengo más de 20 años viviendo aquí en Columbus, Ohio.
I've been living in Columbus, Ohio for more than 20 years.
La primera vez que vine a Estados Unidos fue en 1995.
The first time I came to the United States was in 1995.
Vine con mi papá,
Came with my father,
pero él no sabía que éramos indocumentados.
but I didn't know that we came undocumented.
Y yo tenía, creo que 17 años.
Because I think I was only 17 years old.
Y con el tiempo fui dándome cuenta que era una cosa.
And it was only with time that I realized that I was undocumented.
Yo tengo 3 hijos.
I have 3 children.
Mi hijo el mayor se llama Pedro.
My oldest son's name is Isidro.
Él es nacido aquí en Estados Unidos.
He was born here in the United States.
Mi hijo hizo una petición para poder agregar estatus migratorio.
And he made a petition for me to be able to gain legal status.
Pero con esta administración no puedes arreglar la situación.
But with this new administration, I haven't been able to fix my status.
Y creo que la esposa del presidente, sus papás quisieron arreglar, tal vez, arreglar su estatus migratorio por parte de su hija.
And if, for example, the parents of President Trump's wife, Melania, were able to gain immigration status through that same petition.
Y pues yo no puedo arreglar esa situación.
But I haven't been able to gain status in this.
Tengo segundo hijo, se llama Brando González.
My second son's name is Brando Gonzalez.
Él es nacido en México.
He was born in Mexico.
Y pues él está en espera de una bien para el 2020.
And he's waiting for an immigration court in 2020.
Y mi tercera hija y la más chica se llama Daca.
And my third child and the youngest is Sept.
Y pues ella también es nacida en Ohio.
And she was born here in Columbus, Ohio.
esta lucha que estoy haciendo es por mis hijos, por mi familia.
And this fight that I'm having is to stay is because of my children. It's for my children.
Y creo que el estar aquí en Santuario también es parte de la vida de mis hijos.
And I think that me being here in Sanctuary is also part of my children's life.
Mis hijos tienen una vida afuera
My children have a life outside,
y creo que es muy importante para regresar aquí en Columbus.
and I think it's really important for me to be able to return to my home here in Columbus.
En junio de este año mi hijo Brandon tuvo que ingresar al hospital a la sala de emergencia.
In June of this year, my son Brando had to enter a hospital, enter the emergency room,
Y pues yo no pude estar con él.
and I couldn't be with him.
La semana pasada mi hijo tuvo un accidente de carro.
And last week, my son had a car accident,
Tampoco pude estar con él.
and I couldn't be with him either.
Y creo que estoy perdiéndome de muchas cosas importantes
And I think I'm losing out on really important things
por estar aquí en Santuario.
because I'm here in Sanctuary.
No quiero perder a alguno de mis hijos.
I don't want to lose any of my children,
Pero voy a seguir luchando.
but I'm going to keep fighting.
Yo les pido a todos ustedes su apoyo.
I ask all of you for your support.
He tocado muchas puertas de muchas personas para ayudar,
I have knocked on a lot of doors of a lot of different people to see if they could help me,
pero no lo han hecho.
but they haven't done so.
Creo que ellos tienen el poder para hacerlo
I think they have the power to do it,
y no lo quieren hacer.
and they don't want to.
Y el estar aquí en Santuario ha sido muy difícil para mí.
Being here in Sanctuary has been really difficult for me,
Para toda mi familia.
and for all of my family.
Creo que no solamente para mi familia, sino para millones de personas que están en la misma situación que yo.
And not just for my family, but for millions of people who are in the same situation as me.
Espero por favor alguno de ustedes pueda ayudarnos.
So I hope that some of you can help us.
Si conocen a alguien que lo pueda hacer,
If you know someone who can help,
por favor, díganles que me apoyen, que apoyen a mi familia.
please ask them to support me, to support my family.
En estos momentos estamos esperando el concilio de la ciudad hace una resolución.
At this moment, we are waiting on the City Council here in Columbus to pass a resolution.
Pero no sé si lo vayan a hacer.
But I don't know, it looks like that might not happen.
Creo que es muy importante que ellos me apoyen.
I think it's really important that they support me.
Porque ya no quiero estar aquí tanto.
Because I don't want to be here in Sanctuary.
Thank you so much, Edith, for sharing more of your story and the difficult situation you're in now. And we certainly will keep you in our thoughts and prayers as you seek a proposal before the City Council and try to resolve your situation. We can't even imagine what it's like being stuck in one location for almost a year. So thank you so much for helping us understand the reality of the situation for some undocumented people on the ground. Thank you, Austin, for challenging us to rethink even the idea of sovereignty, how we define it, and for Joe reminding us of our Catholic education and the power of that, as well as the reality of undocumented immigrants that you're working with today, and Joel for the powerful religious and biblical grounding. We have run over a bit in time, and I appreciate you hanging in there with us. Please plan to stay if you have questions or comments, and we'll continue to try to get this on tape and make it available through our website to other people. So is there anyone at this point who would like to make a comment or has a question for Edith, Carrie, or one of our panelists here? If there are no questions in the audience, I'll ask one question, and this is for anyone who would like to answer it, and it is to respond perhaps more directly than you have already, although some people have really alluded to this, but perhaps as many as 30% of Americans disagree with what you're sharing here today, and they would also call themselves Christians, many of them. And what I hear from all of you is compassion for the stranger, the alien, and I know that you're very compassionate people for others, even enemies, and people who disagree with you. So how can we respond with compassion to those who see justice for immigrants in a very different way and feel that their justice and their rights are being threatened by undocumented as well as documented immigrants in the United States today, and that their views are powerfully, finally being represented by the Trump administration? So this is for anyone.
May I take the first swing at the ball
Please.
on that? And I had a remarkable experience a little while ago, maybe a year or two ago, when I was invited to address the East Delaware County Republican Party, who identified itself in the terms of those days as a Tea Party group, and it was well attended afternoon, and the idea was to, as a matter of fact, we had a representative from Catholic Social Services, we had a libertarian, and myself to discuss the issue of immigration as a whole, because it's been a hot topic, or hotter than ever, since 2006. And what became clear as a consequence of that visit is that while the group opposed illegal immigration and based that opposition on much of the narrative that has been mentioned here today, they believe that the immigrants bring a lot of troubles, cannot assimilate, and so on and so forth, was based on lies. It was based on a massive misinformation. And one of the things that I challenged them with as soon as I took the microphone is, I want you to research each and every piece of data that I share with you, every comment that I make, and I want you to prove me wrong. I'm not going to lie to you, and I want to make sure that you challenge me on that. And at the end of the evening, and it was a long discussion, it was over 2 hours, I think, you could tell that while they might still embrace the draconian policies that you are now seeing enacted by their elected candidate, that they were doing so as a matter of political expediency and not as a consequence of misinformation. And I do think that, well, I think two things. I think you can change people's hearts. Unfortunately, we're at a particular point in the political narrative of this country that you maybe can't change a lot of people's votes. And I'll rest with that.
So the importance of knowing facts and being aware of good sources. And would there be good sources that you would particularly recommend to people?
Oh my goodness, there are excellent sources in the media. Now, the problem that you run into today is the whole mess about fake news, because there is, in fact, incorrect and unfounded and there are lies out there. The Southern Poverty Law Center, the National Council of La Raza, Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, are all highly reputable organizations that I donate to, my wife and I donate to, and that we believe in. The news sources, I do believe in CNN, I do believe in Reuters. BBC is a great source for news if you have access to that channel. So those would be my suggestions.
Great, that's very helpful. Question, go ahead.
I didn't get one of the sheets that came around, but I'm wondering, what can we do concretely to help you?
So Joel, do you want to speak to that?
I can. Edith, did you catch that, Carrie? Translate that. There was a question about what people can do concretely to help Edith. I can talk about the events next week, and then if Edith wants to speak to that a little bit. Showing up is important to, for example, the vigil next week, Tuesday evening. What's going to happen there is it'll actually be a vigil, not just a rally, but it'll be a vigil. We'll be praying, we'll be reflecting, but there will also be there'll be some window signs people can take, but also I think there's going to be a call for people to be willing to stand with Edith if she's feeling a sense of urgency about getting out of our church. I feel that sense of urgency about 5:30 every day, and so she's gonna. I think there'll be an opportunity in the next while to support her in a public way with however she's choosing to press or challenge folks who potentially have some power to help her. But otherwise, showing up, spreading the word, telling her story. I believe in stories, that stories are powerful, and that's part of my answer to your first question, is that I think part of the disagreement, it's logical, but it's also emotional, and it's sometimes fear-based, or just sometimes it's separated from reality and from people and from stories. And so, hey, I know this woman named Edith Espinal. She's been living in this church for a year. This is her story. She has 3 children. 2 are American citizens. I believe in keeping families together. Spreading that story is important.
Thank you. I also put together a handout of ways that you can volunteer with organizations that are working with both documented and undocumented immigrants. I made 15 copies, and I'll pass that to Phil, and he can get it started. And so these are organizations represented by our group, such as Solidarity with Edith Espinal. She has a Facebook page with information on it. Avanza is another group, and the Workers Collective is the group. Is that
Central Ohio Worker Center.
Central Ohio Worker Center is one that Austin is on the board of. So there are a number of organizations that that you could volunteer with. So I think what I'll do now.
Edith has
Okay. Oh, and Edith will also respond.
Unless she doesn't want to.
I think Edith just wanted to, if you can show that next week, that's one important step you can take. Like the Facebook page, you know what's coming up in the future, and just help spread Edith's, share her story with everyone you know, and let people in Columbus know that there's a sense of opportunity for her to build forward and find a way to get back home to her family.
Okay, I think the gist of that was the events next week are really important, and showing up and telling other people about those events would be very helpful for her particular process of staying in the United States with her family. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's, every once in a while there's calls out to, call on this senator, let's push here, press there, certainly add your voice to that when it comes up.
Yeah. So there are dozens of people like Edith in sanctuary and churches all over the United States today. The sanctuary movement is expanding, and we're excited about that. It's really calling us to examine our faith and where we stand on these issues. So I think I'm going to call it quits for today, but if you have additional questions, please come up and talk with our panelists. They're passionate about these issues and would love to talk to you. Thanks for attending. Yes, and thank you, Edith.